The night shift at Oak Creek Memorial begins the same way it always does, with fluorescent lights humming their monotonous hymn and the smell of antiseptic so thick it coats the back of your throat. Brooke Sullivan pushes through the employee entrance at 9:16 p.m., 14 minutes early, the way she's been arriving for 3 years. She doesn't rush. She doesn't draw attention. She moves through the corridors of the hospital like someone who has learned that invisibility is a kind of safety. Her badge reads RN, Brooke Sullivan, night shift in plain white lettering. No titles. No decorations. Just a name and a job description that tells you nothing about the hands that are about to steady a dying man's line, or the mind behind those pale blue eyes that can calculate medication ratios faster than most residents can pull up their phones. The break room is empty at this hour. She pours coffee from the pot that tastes like it was brewed sometime during the afternoon and has been slowly achieving sentience ever since. The cup is cool ceramic, chipped on the rim. She doesn't mind. She's held worse things than chipped ceramic. She's held pressure dressings against exit wounds. She's held the hand of a 19-year-old from Oklahoma who died anyway. She's held her own breath in rooms where screaming seemed like the only honest response, and then she smiled at the family and said, "He's comfortable now." Nurse Chen appears in the doorway, moving with the deliberate exhaustion of someone 6 hours into a 12-hour shift. She's holding a tablet, the kind that makes night shift nurses look like they're carrying clipboards from the future. Room 347, Chen says without preamble. Incoming from Walter Reed. Navy SEAL. Critical status. Dr. Sterling's patient, so good luck with that. Brooke's hand trembles. Just slightly. The coffee cup makes a small sound against the ceramic of the sink, a soft clink, like a warning. How long has he been here? Brooke's voice is steady. Controlled. The kind of voice you use when you're standing on a bridge and don't want anyone to notice. 2 hours. His post-op, complications from his initial surgery. Vitals are all over the place. He's already coded once. Chen pauses, watching Brooke with the particular attention nurses reserve for colleagues who react to certain things. You good? Fine, Brooke says. She sets the coffee cup down on the counter with the precision of someone diffusing something delicate. I'm fine. But she's not fine. Not quite. Because somewhere in the building right now, in a room with fluorescent lights and heart monitors that beep like mechanical insects, there's a Navy SEAL fighting demons that no amount of medication can touch. And she knows exactly what those demons look like. She's seen them in mirrors. She's woken up in the middle of the night with her hands still shaking from them. She touches the scar on her left forearm, a thin line of white tissue barely visible against her skin. When people ask about it, she tells them a car accident. It's easier than the truth. The truth lives in a locker on the 3rd floor of this hospital, packed into a cardboard box like something that needs to stay buried. The 3rd floor is quiet. The shift change is complete. Most patients are sleeping, or trying to, or giving up on sleep altogether and staring at the ceiling tiles like they contain the answers to questions they stopped asking years ago. Brooke moves past the nurses' station where the day shift has left their notes. Room 347 is at the far end of the corridor, where the light from the main station doesn't quite reach. The room smells like antiseptic and something underneath it, fear, maybe. Or pain. She's learned that pain has a smell if you've been trained to recognize it. Like copper and urgency mixed together with the particular sterile staleness of a room where someone has been fighting their own body. Marcus Reeves is sedated but not sleeping. There's a difference. His hands are moving against the sheet, small movements, like he's looking for something. His eyes are closed but his jaw is clenched so tight she can see the muscle working beneath the skin. The fur line in his left arm is running normal saline. His monitor shows a heart rate hovering around 112, elevated, sympathetic nervous system activated. He's not having a psychotic break. Anyone trained enough knows the difference. Psychotic breaks are chaotic. This is organized. Controlled. This is a man's body responding to a specific memory with the kind of precision that comes from repetition. This is muscle memory expressing itself through vital signs. "Hey," Brooke says quietly. She doesn't touch him. Not yet. She just stands where he can almost see her if he opens his eyes. "You're safe. You're in Norfolk. You're at Oak Creek Memorial." His hands stop moving. Just for a second. Just long enough for her to know that something in her voice registered as safe. As true. "I'm going to check your 4, she continues, keeping her voice at the exact frequency that doesn't startle. The frequency she learned in a field hospital in Helmand Province, talking to men whose bodies were running on adrenaline and shock. "Your name is," she glances at his chart. "Marcus. You're a Navy SEAL. You're alive. Everything else can wait." His breathing slows. Not immediately, but incrementally. She can see it in the monitor. She can see it in the way his shoulders drop into the mattress. The heart rate ticks down from 112 to 108 to 105. She works methodically, checking the line, adjusting the drip, noting his vitals in the chart with the kind of precise handwriting that leaves no room for misinterpretation. She's learned that precision is how you tell people you know what you're doing without having to say it out loud. The door opens. Dr. Sterling enters without knocking, moving through the space with the kind of authority that comes from never being asked to wait. He's tall, early 50s, with the kind of jawline that looks like it was carved by someone who understood the relationship between aesthetics and power. His white coat is immaculate. His shoes are expensive. His presence makes the air in the room feel slightly more compressed, like the atmosphere has adjusted to accommodate his significance. He doesn't acknowledge Brooke immediately. He goes to the monitor first, studying the vitals with the expression of a man reading a balance sheet. Then he looks at Marcus, really looks at him, with the kind of detachment that comes from seeing humans as problems to be solved rather than people to be helped. "He had another episode about 30 minutes ago," Brooke says. "Elevated heart rate, some involuntary hand movements. Patient is post-trauma, likely experiencing flashback symptomatology. He responded well to verbal de-escalation and reassurance." Dr. Sterling doesn't look at her. "I'm going to prescribe 10 milligrams of haloperidol. Push it now." Brooke doesn't move. "Doctor, I don't think." "You think?" Sterling's eyes meet hers for the first time, and there's something in them that looks like amusement. Like he's watching a particularly dumb dog try to open a door. "You're a floor nurse, Sullivan. Not a psychiatrist. Not a trauma specialist. Just a floor nurse. Do what I said." She could comply. The haloperidol would suppress his central nervous system. It would make him docile. It would also be the wrong medication for a man whose body is processing trauma, not psychosis. It would be like treating pain with a sledgehammer when the patient needs precision. "This patient is experiencing PTSD-related hyperarousal," Brooke says. Her voice hasn't changed. Still deferential. Still quiet. But there's something underneath it now, something cold and measured. Antipsychotics can trigger paradoxical reactions in trauma patients. Has his psychiatric history been reviewed? Sterling's jaw tightens. He's not used to being questioned. The way his fingers curl slightly into fists tells her that. But there are witnesses, the monitor, the chart, the camera in the corner. So instead of escalating, he smiles. It's not a kind smile. It's the smile of someone who has decided to make a note of something for later. "I'll take your concerns under advisement," he says, and the words are shaped like civility but sound like a threat. "For now, the haloperidol. That's an order." She doesn't argue. There's no point in arguing. She prepares the injection with the kind of precision that feels like protest. 10 milligrams haloperidol in a syringe that she holds up to the light to verify the dose, and Sterling watches her like he's trying to memorize the exact moment she stops fighting him. But something shifts in that room. Some kind of line gets drawn. Some kind of understanding passes between them, silent and absolute. He knows she disagrees. She knows he doesn't care. And both of them know that this isn't over. The injection goes in smooth and clean. Marcus's breathing deepens immediately. The monitor shows his heart rate dropping, his body accepting the chemical sedation like a surrender. Within 2 minutes he's back under, properly unconscious now, not the half-aware state he was in before. Sterling nods, satisfied. Continue current monitoring. Let me know if there are any changes. He leaves the way he came, without acknowledgement, without thanks, moving back down the corridor toward the nurse's station where the real work happens. Where decisions are made. Where night shift nurses don't get to have opinions about whether those decisions are medically sound. Brooke stands in the room for a moment longer, watching Marcus sleep under chemical restraint, and her jaw works the same way his did before the medication. Something is clenched inside her that no amount of controlled breathing can loosen. But she has a shift to finish. She has patients to tend to. She has a reputation for being invisible and competent and unbothered by the hierarchy that filters down from the top. So she walks out of 347 and heads back toward her locker on the first floor, where the real secrets live. The locker room smells like industrial cleaning solution and something underneath it, the particular staleness of a space where people briefly exist between their real lives and their work lives. Locker 47 is on the bottom shelf, the one that requires kneeling to access. She uses her key, the standard issue, nothing special, and opens it to the space behind her spare scrubs and the pair of compression socks she rotates through. The boots are wrapped in plastic, the kind of careful packaging that suggests they've been deliberately preserved. Not hidden, preserved. There's a difference. The leather is scarred and creased and discolored in places where things that shouldn't have touched them did touch them. The laces still have the tags attached, Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, call sign Reaper. 3 tours. Sangin Valley. Helmand Province. Afghanistan. She unwraps one boot enough to feel the weight of it in her hands. Genuine leather. Breaking down at the seams. Soaked in things that no amount of washing would completely remove. These boots have stood in blood. They've carried her through villages where the buildings were still smoking. They've navigated spaces where every shadow contained a decision that would take years to stop regretting. She wraps them back up, carefully, the way someone might wrap a body. Then she pushes them back behind her spare scrubs where they belong, closes the locker, and spins the combination lock 3 times in both directions. When she stands up, her knees hurt. But that's not why her eyes are closed. The break room is slightly less empty when she returns. Nurses from the day shift are lingering past their scheduled end time, the way they do when there's gossip that needs to be shared. She can hear them before she enters, their voices dropping to a particular frequency that suggests they know she's coming. Complete madness, Sterling made an actual bet about it. Didn't even know what she was stepping into. Gives her a week. Says she'll quit before then. 1 week. Brooke pours herself another cup of the coffee that tastes like punishment. The room goes quiet. The way rooms do when someone walks in and the room needs to decide whether to keep talking. Dr. Sterling is standing near the far counter, leaning against the sink with the casual confidence of someone in his own kingdom. He's holding a coffee cup that probably costs more than Brooke makes in a week. When he sees her, his smile returns, that same smile from room 347, all teeth and no warmth. Sullivan, he says, and his voice carries across the room like he's speaking to the entire night shift, not just to her. I'm placing a wager. Before this week is finished, you'll realize you're not cut out for this job and you'll resign. I'll even give you odds. 50-50 proposition. Brooke sets her coffee cup down. She doesn't pour from the pot. She doesn't make eye contact. She just sets the cup down on the counter with the kind of finality that suggests it's a statement. That won't be necessary, Doctor, she says quietly. Oh, I'm not worried about the necessity, Sterling says. I'm concerned about the inevitability. You're good at following orders and keeping your head down. But when the real work starts, when you have to actually demonstrate competence instead of just appearing humble. He shrugs. People like you don't last. The room is completely silent now. The kind of silence that comes from everyone waiting to see what comes next, like they're watching a moment of television that will define their workplace dynamics for months. Brooke picks up her coffee cup, the one she hasn't poured anything into, and raises it to her lips. It's empty. She drinks from an empty cup with the same composure she would drink from a full one. Then she sets it back down and walks out of the break room without responding, without defending herself, without giving Sterling anything except the demonstration that she will not be baited. But in the hallway, moving back toward the patient floors, something in her shoulders drops. Some kind of weight settles into place. And she thinks about those boots in locker 47, about the tags still attached to the laces, about 3 tours and Sangin Valley, and the fact that she spent 18 months learning how to stay alive in situations where staying alive seemed statistically impossible. Sterling wants a week. That's what he said. She has a feeling he's not going to get it. What happens next changes everything. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above room 347 as Dr. Sterling rounded on his team the next morning, his white coat moving like a surgeon's knife through tissue. Brooke stood at the foot of the bed, already knowing what she would see. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Reeves thrashed against the railings, his body rigid, sweat soaking through the hospital gown. His voice came out shattered, fragmented. Grid 6927. Grid 6927. Where's my squad? Where's? He wasn't psychotic. She knew the difference. She'd held dying men in her arms in field hospitals where the ground itself seemed to breathe fire, and she knew the architecture of a trauma response the way most people knew their own faces. Sterling snapped his fingers at the nurse's station. I want him sedated. 20 milligrams of diazepam for push, stat. Brooke stepped forward. Her voice came out soft, measured, deferential the way she'd learned to make herself small 3 years ago. Doctor, this presents as a trauma response, not psychosis. Grounding techniques might be more effective. Sedation during flashbacks can intensify the disorientation. Anne. Sterling turned toward her as if she'd materialized from the floor itself. His eyes were the color of ice water and twice as cold. He spoke loud enough for the 2 residents and 3 nurses crowding the doorway to hear every syllable. I wasn't asking for a diagnosis from someone whose medical degree came from a correspondence course. Sedate him. Now. The room went dead silent. Brooke took one measured breath. Then another. She felt something crack inside her chest, like old concrete splitting open, not the crack of breaking, but the crack of something ancient remembering its own strength. A single tear escaped before she could stop it. She wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact. Sedation during flashbacks can intensify the disorientation, but you're the physician, doctor. Sterling stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the expensive cologne he wore like a weapon. His smile was the smile of a man who'd just won something. And don't forget it, sweetheart. The word hung in the air like poison gas. She felt it settle into the room, into the tissues of everyone watching. That's what he did. He didn't just give orders, he seasoned them with contempt, the way some men season food with salt. He needed them to taste it. He needed them to know they were beneath him. Brooke prepared the medication without another word. She drew 20 milligrams of diazepam into a syringe, inserted the needle into Marcus's full line, and administered the push with steady hands. Within 90 seconds, his thrashing slowed, then stopped. His breathing deepened. His body went slack against the restraints. She adjusted his monitor leads and checked his vitals without looking at Sterling again, though she could feel him watching her from the doorway, satisfied as a predator that had successfully marked its territory. The bet he announced in the nurse's station that afternoon carried the weight of an execution order. He said it loud enough for the entire floor to hear, standing with his arms crossed while the late shift team filed in for handoff. I'm making a personal wager. Sullivan here quits within 1 week. The pressure of actual medical standards is too much for some people. Anyone want to take that action? 2 attending physicians laughed, that particular laugh that men with power use to confirm the pecking order. Brooke filed her charting at the far end of the station, her hands moving across the keyboard with mechanical precision. The keys made small clicking sounds like insects. She didn't look up. She didn't defend herself. She simply existed in the space they'd made for her and let them think they'd broken something. But that wasn't the worst part. 3 days later, she carried her lunch tray through the cafeteria, a turkey sandwich she didn't want, apple slices she wouldn't eat, a container of yogurt that tasted like chemical apology. She was passing Sterling's table, far enough away that there was no accusation in her proximity, when his shoulder bumped hers. Deliberately. Slowly. His movements had a casual cruelty to them, the kind of precise negligence that everyone saw as an accident. The tray went down. Food scattered across the floor in a broken constellation. 24 staff members froze. Doctors. Nurses. Custodians. All of them watching the same scene. Sterling didn't apologize. He didn't even acknowledge what had happened. He simply watched her, the way a man watches an experiment. Testing her. Seeing if the pressure would make her crack. Brooke crouched down. She picked up each piece of turkey sandwich with deliberate care, placing them on the tray. The apple slices followed. The yogurt container had opened, its contents spreading across the tile like spilled blood. She wiped it with a napkin, working methodically, her movements precise as surgical procedure. The room stayed silent except for the soft sound of her collecting the pieces of her own humiliation. She stood, the ruined tray in her hands, and looked at Sterling across the space between them. Accidents happen to everyone eventually, Doctor. She walked to the trash and threw the entire thing away. Then she went to the vending machine and bought another sandwich she wouldn't eat, as if the first one had never existed. As if she had never crouched on that floor. The chart throwing happened on day 4, outside the ICU, where Sterling had just finished rounds. Brooke was walking Marcus Reeves' file back to the record station when Sterling stepped directly into her path. He was holding something in his hand, a hardcover journal, maybe 2 pounds of consequence. He didn't hand it to her. He threw it. Not hard. Not violent. Just deliberate, the way you'd test if a floor could hold your weight. The journal hit the floor and papers exploded outward. Medical charts, lab results, notes scattered like wounded birds. Sterling's smile was the smile of a man watching dominoes fall. Pick that up, sweetheart. It's what you're qualified for. Brooke watched the papers settle. She could feel the hallway closing in, could sense the attention of the 3 nurses who'd witnessed what happened. Their shock was a flavor in the air, metallic and bitter. She took a single breath that felt like it lasted for years. Then she crouched and began gathering the pages, one by one. Each page had her sealed patient's information on it. Classified unit designation. Classified next of kin section. Medical history so thoroughly redacted that entire lines disappeared into thick black marker. She read them as she collected them, her hands moving with the kind of composure that comes from having already survived the worst. She gathered every page. Stacked them in order. Stood up and handed the journal back to Sterling without letting her eyes stay on his face long enough for him to claim the moment had wounded her. One day you'll understand that cruelty and competence are not the same thing, Doctor. His jaw tightened. His hand closed around the journal like a man gripping a life preserver that was slowly slipping away. In that moment, she understood something fundamental about Dr. Sterling. He wasn't trying to make her quit because she was incompetent. He was trying to make her quit because some part of him had recognized that she wasn't. And cruelty was the only language he had for that recognition. She walked to the break room and poured herself a cup of black coffee that had probably been sitting in the pot since the morning shift. It tasted like burnt metal. She drank it anyway. That night, 3 hours into the evening shift, she began checking on Marcus Reeves during her break, reading his chart when Sterling wasn't watching. His file was a catalogue of redaction. Next of kin, classified. Unit assignment, classified. Mission details, layer upon layer of black marker so thick she could have used the page to sharpen knives. But someone, a Walter Reed nurse, probably, someone who still had the capacity for mercy, had paperclipped a handwritten note inside the file. The note made her hands go steady in a way she didn't remember learning. Patient repeatedly asks for Senior Chief Sullivan. Says she needs to know he kept his promise to Jake. Brooke closed the file. Her chest felt like it was compressing around her heart. Jake. Her son. Currently deployed with SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon, somewhere in Helmand Province where the mountains had names in Pashto and the mortar fire had no mercy. She returned to room 347 at 11 p.m., when the hallways had the quality of held breath, when the hospital seemed to exist in a state of suspension between one day and the next. Marcus Reeves was awake. Conscious. His eyes tracked her as she entered. She adjusted his 4 lines and checked his monitor, moving through the ritual of care with a kind of precision that comes from hands that have done this under fire. And then he grabbed her wrist. His grip was surprising, strong, the grip of a man who still had some of his infrastructure intact despite the damage the last 3 days had done. You look like him. Like Jake. Are you? She gently removed his hand and placed it against the blanket. Her voice came out as soft as it ever got. I'm your nurse, Commander. You need to rest. His eye searched her face like a man reading a map to somewhere he desperately needed to get. I wrote his mother 3 letters. Told her how proud, he coughed, and she could hear the way pain hijacked his breathing. I promised him I'd find you. He worries. Brooke's composure fractured for just a moment. She turned away from the bed, pretending to check the monitor leads, pretending to adjust the ventilator settings, giving herself the small grace of 3 seconds where no one could see her face. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. But her voice, when she spoke, came from somewhere deeper than she usually allowed. What did you promise him? Marcus managed, that someone would tell you. That he's okay. That he's becoming the man you raised. She nodded once. Then she left the room before he could see the cost of that composure, before she could let him see the woman beneath the nurse. In the hallway, she leaned against the cold tile wall. Her breathing was measured, controlled, the kind of breathing she taught herself in field hospitals where the alternative was falling apart while men were still dying in front of you. Dr. Sterling rounded the corner not 20 seconds later. His eyes narrowed when he saw her standing outside room 347. Developing attachments to patients, Sullivan? That's another performance issue for your file. She straightened. When she spoke, her voice had already shifted into something different, flatter, more precise. Just ensuring continuity of care, doctor. He stepped closer. The smell of his cologne came with him, aggressive and expensive. Stay away from that seal. He's my patient. My case study. You're just the help. He held her eyes for a moment, looking for the crack he'd already made in her, looking for the place where his cruelty had taken root. Then he walked past her, his shoes making soft clicking sounds against the tile. That night, as she charted her 11 p.m. vitals, Brooke noticed something in Marcus's monitor readings. The changes were subtle, the kind of subtle that lives in the space between normal and catastrophic. His cardiac output was dropping incrementally. His central venous pressure was climbing in ways that suggested fluid accumulating somewhere it had no business being. Pericardial effusion. The fluid around his heart building like a quiet emergency, the kind that only someone who'd worked in field hospitals would recognize in its earliest stages. She pulled his chart again. Check the lab work. The X-ray from 2 days ago. The EKG from this morning. And then she heard Dr. Sterling's voice in her mind, stay away from that seal. He's my patient. The fluorescent lights hummed above her head, and Brooke Sullivan sat in the nurse's station, holding the knowledge of what was coming, and waited to see what would happen next. The nurse's station fell quiet as Brooke finished her rounds at 11:08 p.m. She moved through the motions, vitals logged, charts updated, medication counts verified, but her mind stayed in room 347. Marcus Reeves. The name meant nothing to anyone here. His chart said SEAL team rotation, classified deployment, and that was all the hospital needed. But Brooke had learned long ago that classified meant she'd never know the real story, never understand why a man like that was dying alone in a cardiac unit in Norfolk. She found herself walking past his room again during the 12:15 a.m. bed check. Marcus was asleep, his chest rising and falling with effort that shouldn't require that much work. She stood in the doorway, pretending to review the monitors, but really she was watching the way his body was fighting. The breathing pattern had changed since her last shift. Shallower. More rapid. His SpO2 hovering at 94% when it should be 97 or better. She made a note, small, careful notation in her personal pocket notebook, not the chart. Not yet. By 12:50 a.m., Brooke couldn't ignore it anymore. She pulled Marcus's full medical record into the computer system, scanning past the redactions and blank spaces. Next of kin, classified. Emergency contact, classified. Unit assignment, classified. It was like reading a file written in disappearing ink. But the lab work wasn't classified. The imaging wasn't classified. And what she saw made her throat tighten. The pericardial fluid on his last ultrasound had measured 1.2 centimeters. Small. Not critical. But fluid in the sac around the heart had a way of accumulating fast when a trauma patient's tissues were still swelling, still bleeding into spaces they shouldn't. She pulled up his chest wall compliance data, the measurement of how easily his lungs expanded. It was declining. Dropping in small increments with each passing hour. 0.8 yesterday. 0.76 this morning. 0.71 now. The numbers were telling a story her hands already knew. Cardiac tamponade. The heart being slowly strangled by its own protective sac filling with fluid. A ticking clock that nobody else was watching. She sat at the nurse's station with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, staring at those numbers like they were written in a language only she could read. Around her, the hospital hummed with the quiet rhythm of night shift, distant monitor beeps, the ventilator in Bay 2 cycling steadily, the soft squeak of a nursing cart rolling down the corridor. Normal sounds. The sound of a place that didn't know it was about to lose someone. At 1:38 a.m., Brooke made her decision. She pulled up Marcus's vitals one more time and did the math. Fluid accumulation at this rate. Compliance declining. O2 requirements climbing. 60 minutes. Maybe 70 if she was generous. After that, his heart would stop working. Simple as that. One moment beating, the next just a muscle wrapped in its own death. She picked up the phone and dialed Dr. Sterling's extension. 3 rings. Voicemail. His voice came through, professional and cold. You've reached Dr. Sterling's office. Please call back during business hours or contact the on-call physician. Brooke hung up without leaving a message. She called again. And again. The voicemail greeting repeated, each time like a door slamming shut. She paged him overhead. Dr. Sterling, call the nurse's station immediately. Nothing. She tried his cell phone. Voicemail again. She called the on-call cardiologist, a Dr. Hassan she'd never worked with before. The operator said he was already in a trauma case, expected to be tied up for at least 2 more hours. The attending physician didn't pick up either. His nurse said he was reviewing charts in his office and didn't want to be disturbed unless it was a true emergency. This was a true emergency. But nobody else could see it yet. Brooke stood up from the nurse's station, her hand steady as she walked down the hallway toward the locker room. The fluorescent lights above cast everything in a pale glow that made the world feel like it was underwater. She opened her locker and stared at the shelf where the boots sat, scuffed leather, worn soles, the kind of boots that had walked through desert and dust and rubble. Behind them, pushed back where she kept forgetting about it, was a small flat leather case. She hadn't touched it in 8 years. Her field surgical kit. The one from Sangin. The one she'd packed when she was still the person the Navy trained to save lives under fire, not someone who took a pulse and called a doctor. She held the case in both hands for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened it. The needle was still there. The ultrasound gel. The small sterile drapes. Everything preserved like instruments in a museum of a life that didn't belong to her anymore. She was supposed to be a nurse now. Licensed, credentialed, bound by scope and protocol and the chain of command. She was supposed to call the doctor. Wait. Defer. Trust the system. But the system wasn't answering. Brooke tucked the case under her arm and walked back toward room 347. Her footsteps were quiet on the tile floor. Her breathing came steady. Not fast. Not panicked. The way you breathed when you'd already made peace with what came next. Marcus was more awake when she entered, his eyes tracking her with the kind of focus that only comes when you're running on fumes. His lips had taken on a subtle blue tint that the pulse oximeter hadn't caught yet but would catch soon. He was a man watching himself fail and being powerless to stop it. "How are you feeling, Commander?" Brooke's voice had changed. Lower. Steadier. The voice of someone who'd given orders on a battlefield, not someone who took them in a hospital corridor. Marcus's eyes went wide for a fraction of a second. Not at her words. At something in the way she'd said them. Like I'm. He swallowed hard, drowning. "You're not drowning." She was already setting up the portable ultrasound, her hands moving with a precision that belonged to someone who'd done this under fire, literally and figuratively. "You have fluid around your heart. Too much fluid. It's compressing the heart chambers, making it harder for your cardiac output to sustain itself. We need to get that fluid out." Marcus tried to sit up. "You need Sterling. You need." Sterling isn't answering. She applied the conductive gel and began the scan, watching the dark space around his cardiac silhouette expand and contract with each heartbeat. Massive. A wall of fluid pressing inward. She switched to measurements. 2.1 centimeters. The fluid had nearly doubled in 8 hours. She looked at his face. "How long do you think you have, Commander?" He understood the question. Men like Marcus always understood. Minutes. Close to an hour. But yes, not long. Brooke set down the ultrasound probe and moved to the supply cart. She was already opening the sterile field, already pulling on new gloves. The movements were automatic now. Muscle memory taking over. Pain was information, and her muscles were screaming with information. "You can't do this," Marcus said, but there was no question in his voice. No doubt. Just the kind of statement a man makes when he knows he's watching someone make a choice that will cost them. "Watch me." She prepped the site, the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She could draw the landmarks on his chest with her eyes closed. She'd done it in an operating hooch in Sangin under moonlight with IED shrapnel still singing through the air outside. She could do it here. The needle felt right in her hand. She had just positioned the ultrasound probe to guide the insertion when the door to room 347 swung open hard enough to hit the wall. Dr. Sterling stood in the doorway, his face already reddening, his eyes finding the needle in her hand like a missile tracking a target. "Step away from that patient immediately," he said, his voice carrying the kind of command that came from institutional power, not earned authority. Brooke didn't move. She didn't even look at him. "He has cardiac tamponade," she said calmly. "He'll be dead in 20 minutes without intervention. Then we'll handle it." Sterling stepped into the room, his hand reaching out. "You are not qualified. You are not authorized. And if you proceed, you will be fired before this patient's next heartbeat." She looked at Marcus. Watched his chest barely moving. Heard the subtle rasp of breath that sounded like a drowning man. She thought of Jake, her son, this man's subordinate, this man's responsibility. She thought of the 3 letters Marcus had written, each one beginning with "I'm proud of your son." She took one measured breath. And inserted the needle. The needle advanced with surgical precision. Ultrasound guidance showed the dark fluid pooling around Marcus's heart like an accusation. 200 milliliters of blood, almost black in the syringe, drawn from the pericardial sac with the steady hand of someone who'd done this before. In a Sangin field hospital. Under mortar fire. With casualties stacked on cots and no one coming to help. Her hands didn't shake. The pressure released. Air hissed from the needle like breath escaping. Marcus's oxygen saturation climbed immediately, 68 to 71 to 76. His color returned. Pink spreading across gray skin like dawn breaking over a valley. The cardiac monitor shifted from the frantic percussion of tamponade to something almost normal. Sinus rhythm. Steady. Alive. For minutes. The entire procedure, for minutes. Dr. Sterling stood frozen in the doorway, his face cycling through shock, fury, and the dawning realization that his absolute control over this moment had just evaporated. His jaw worked silently for 3 seconds. Then he moved. "You just ended your career." His voice wasn't loud. It was worse than loud. It was the voice of a man watching his kingdom crumble. "Security. Now. This nurse is to be escorted from the building immediately." But Marcus was breathing normally. His vitals stable. His heart no longer dying in his chest. Sterling had to examine him. Had to verify the procedure had worked, had to check the needle insertion point and review the fluid drawn and confirm that a night shift nurse with no attending physician present had just performed an emergency surgical intervention that saved a Navy SEAL's life. His hands trembled as he examined Marcus. Pure rage masquerading as professionalism. When he looked back at Brooke, his eyes were the color of a storm with nowhere to go. "You're suspended. Effective immediately. Practicing outside the scope of licensure, a level 4 violation. I want your badge, your credentials, and your resignation letter on my desk within the hour. If you refuse to comply, I will have you arrested." She unclipped her badge, the ID photo showing a woman she barely recognized anymore, and placed it on the bedside table beside Marcus's monitor. The badge caught the fluorescent light and lay there like a discarded weapon. Then she turned and walked out of room 347 with her spine straight and her eyes forward, moving with the practiced calm of someone who'd already survived the worst. Sterling followed her into the hallway, his voice dropping into the tone he reserved for broken men. "You have no idea what you've just done. I will end you. By the time the board is through with you, you won't work as a phlebotomist in a clinic in rural Virginia. You'll be lucky to." She didn't turn around. She kept walking toward the exit, and Sterling stood alone in the corridor, watching her go, his threats dissolving into the hum of fluorescent lights and the beep of distant monitors. The hospital around them was silent, nurses at their stations, residents frozen, everyone watching the moment their chief of surgery lost absolute dominion over his domain. Brooke pushed through the ER doors into the pre-dawn darkness. 20 minutes later, Sterling was in his office with the door closed and his personal cell phone pressed to his ear. The hospital board president, Dr. Raymond Bancroft, answered on the third ring. He'd been awake, the kind of man who never fully slept, always listening for the sound of institutional catastrophe. "Raymond, we have a situation." Sterling's voice was steady now. "Weaponized. A rogue nurse just performed emergency surgery on a SEAL patient without authorization. Cardiac procedure. Pericardiocentesis. Complete scope violation. If this gets to the press before we control the narrative, Oak Creek Memorial is looking at liability exposure that could sink the entire institution. I need her terminated, her file flagged, her nursing license reviewed by the state board before word gets out. We need to move tonight." Bancroft listened. "Then, you documented the violation." "I witnessed it personally. I was about to intervene when she inserted the needle. The procedure was successful, the patient is stable, but that doesn't matter legally. She crossed a line that no nurse should cross. I'm concerned she may have been involved in other scope violations over the past 3 years. We need a full investigation." By 3 a.m., Sterling had made 4 phone calls. By 6 a.m., he'd sent emails to Brooke's nursing school requesting her complete academic file, any disciplinary records, and her instructor's assessment of her clinical judgment and emotional stability. By 9 a.m., he'd contacted her 3 previous employers, framing the inquiry as a standard reference check while asking pointed questions about whether she'd ever shown signs of overstepping her authority or making decisions that conflicted with physician direction. The implication was there. The rot was there. All that was needed was the appearance of legitimacy. He brought in an outside healthcare consultant, a woman named Dr. Patricia Walsh from a firm that specialized in hospital compliance audits. Walsh arrived at Oak Creek Memorial on the afternoon of the second day, carried 2 boxes of files into a temporary office, and spent 48 hours reviewing every chart Brooke Sullivan had touched in 3 years of night shifts. Every patient interaction. Every note. Every decision documented. The consultant found nothing. Brooke's charting was meticulous. Her documentation exceeded standards. Her clinical assessments were precise, her notes comprehensive, her adherence to protocol flawless. There was no evidence of scope violation, no pattern of overreach, no indication of anything except a nurse operating at the absolute peak of competence. But Sterling didn't need proof. Proof was optional. What he needed was narrative. On the morning of the third day, Brooke received a certified letter from Oak Creek Memorial's Human Resources Department. The envelope was white. The letterhead was official. The content was absolute. Employment terminated for cause. Effective immediately. Reason, practicing outside scope of licensure. Patient safety violation. Personnel file flagged for nursing board review. Badge access revoked. All credentials suspended pending state investigation. By noon, 2 hospital security officers had entered her locker. Her scrubs, her stethoscope, the photo of Jake in his dress uniform on the first day at SEAL training, everything removed and placed into a cardboard box. The boots, those worn, scuffed combat boots that had walked through 3 provinces and carried her away from the woman she used to be, dumped unceremoniously on top of everything else, laces tangled. Brooke sat in her car in the hospital parking lot, the cardboard box on the passenger seat, staring at nothing for 17 minutes. Then she drove. Riverside Cemetery sat on the western edge of Norfolk, separated from the city by a quarter-mile stretch of rural roads where the world felt like it was holding its breath. David's grave was in the southeast corner, beneath a oak tree that had been young when he died and was only now becoming something ancient. She kneeled in the rain without hesitation, without ceremony, without the dignity she'd maintained in public. The mud soaked through her scrubs. Her hands pressed into the wet earth like she could reach through it to find him. The words came the way words come when you've spent 3 years not saying them. I thought I could save people without being that person again. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I thought I could just be Jake's mom, your wife, just a normal nurse nobody noticed. I could wear scrubs instead of body armor. I could work nights and pretend I was running from the schedule instead of running from memories. The rain intensified, cold and relentless. But I failed, David. I failed Marcus tonight. And I'm failing our son because he doesn't even know what his mother is. And I failed you because I promised I'd put it down, all of it, the killing and the trauma and the field medicine and the part of me that wakes up at 2 a.m. thinking about Sangin. She pressed her forehead against the wet stone of his headstone. I'm so tired of hiding. But I don't know how to stop. The rain fell harder, and she knelt there while the cemetery emptied and the day moved toward something like evening, and the secret she'd been carrying for 3 years remained unbroken. Just a nurse. Just a woman on her knees in the rain, grieving a man and a life she could never go back to. She had no idea that 6 miles away, in a federal detention facility, a protected witness was identifying her from a hospital security photo. She had no idea that the FBI was already making phone calls. She had no idea that her son was looking at his phone, reading a text message from Commander Marcus Reeves, and the text message was asking the one question that would shatter everything. Does your mother know I remember her from Sangin? Within 48 hours of saving Marcus Reeves's life, Brooke Sullivan's employment ended not with a conversation but with a manila envelope left on her apartment doorstep. Suspension pending termination. The words were printed in Arial 12-point, impersonal as a utility bill. The allegation, practicing outside scope of licensure. The investigator's note cited her performance of a pericardiocentesis without physician authorization, the exact procedure that had kept a Navy SEAL breathing through the night. Dr. Sterling had moved fast, his phone calls already made before dawn. The hospital board president had been roused at 6 in the morning. By noon, 2 HR representatives appeared at Oak Creek Memorial, staff in trance with a cardboard box containing her locker's contents, extra scrubs, a stethoscope she'd owned for 9 years, and at the bottom, wrapped in a paper towel, those worn combat boots. The drive to Calvary Cemetery took 18 minutes from her apartment. Rain hammered the windshield in waves, and Brooke kept both hands on the wheel, watching the wipers fight a losing battle. The cardboard box sat in the passenger seat, its edges already softening from the moisture seeping through. She didn't look at it. She knew what was inside. She'd been avoiding what was inside for 3 years. The gravel path to Thomas Sullivan's grave was slick with water and dead leaves. Brooke knelt in the mud without changing out of her scrubs. There was something honest about that, she thought. The stain of Norfolk rain on white cotton, mixing with the dark earth. Her knees sank into the wet ground, and she didn't move to stop it. The rain fell cold against her neck, and she tilted her face upward for a moment, letting it run down her cheeks, though whether that was rain or tears, she couldn't say. Maybe the distinction didn't matter anymore. I thought I could save people without being that person again, she whispered to the grave marker. Her voice sounded small against the sound of the rain. I thought I could hide the boots and hide the years and hide what I knew how to do, and somehow that would be enough. That would make me clean again. The words tore out of her like something that had been trapped too long. I failed Marcus. I failed Jake. And I failed you because I spent 3 years in that hospital pretending you didn't teach me to choose people over protocol. A car door closed in the distance. Brooke didn't turn around. Let whoever it was think she was grieving. Let them think that was the only reason a woman knelt bleeding in the rain. The FBI investigation began when a former Taliban fighter, a man named Fahim who'd spent for years in a black site and now lived under federal protection in a Bethesda safe house, was admitted to Oak Creek Memorial for an emergency appendectomy. He was being escorted through the corridor under heavy guard when he saw the security footage playing on a waiting room monitor. An ICU nurse being escorted out. An older male nurse saying something cruel. Fahim froze mid-step, and the agents flanking him tensed, hands moving toward. That woman, Fahim said quietly, in English with a Pashto accent that had barely faded. I know her. From Sangin. She pulled me from a burning vehicle in 2009. When the IED hit our convoy. He looked at the federal agents. I was wearing insurgent clothing. She pulled me out anyway. Stopped the bleeding. Kept me alive until the medevac came. One of the agents was already on his phone. Within 2 hours, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had opened a file labeled Sullivan, Brooke, a medical professional. Within 4 hours, they had pulled her military service record. Within 6, they understood that a decorated combat medic had been working night shifts at a Norfolk hospital under a name and identity so divorced from her actual history that she might as well have been a ghost. By 7 o'clock that evening, Brooke's apartment door opened to the sound of boots on hardwood. Military-issue boots. The walk that comes with discipline. Jake Sullivan stood in full dress uniform, the navy dress whites of an officer serving in the Nuclear Submarine Command, and his face was doing something between shock and betrayal and desperate love that made her forget how to breathe. Mom, he said, and his voice cracked on the single syllable. Why didn't you tell me you were Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan? Brooke's hands opened and closed. She sat down because standing required a strength she didn't have. How did you? Commander Reeves called me. He was running through all his service records, people who'd saved his life, and he found your service photo. From 2008. And he remembered. He called me and he asked if my mother was a nurse named Brooke Sullivan, and I told him yes, and he said. Jake's voice wavered. He said that wasn't possible, because the woman he knew had a rank in a unit and a name the entire SEAL community still talked about. And I realized you'd been a ghost your whole life, and I'd been your son, and I never even knew. I was trying to protect you, Brooke said quietly. From what? From who you were. Jake knelt in front of her, still in his dress whites, and took her hands. Mom. The entire Pentagon knows who you are. On the fourth day, Admiral Chen walked through the lobby of Oak Creek Memorial like a man who'd commanded carrier battle groups and made presidents listen. His uniform was pressed with creases that could cut paper. His presence made the fluorescent light seem inadequate, the space too small to contain him. The hospital staff felt it before they understood it, that shift in air pressure that comes when real authority enters a room. He stood in the center of the lobby, and his voice, when he spoke, had the quality of a tank idling in a garage, power held in reserve. "I'm Admiral James Chen," he said. "I'm here regarding Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan." The lobby went silent. Phones stopped ringing. Staff members appeared from corridors as if magnetized. Senior Chief Sullivan served 3 tours in Helmand Province between 2007 and 2011. Her record includes 2 Bronze Stars for leadership under fire, 2 Purple Hearts, 1 Navy Cross for valor in Sangin Valley, where she led a joint medical operation that saved 43 lives, including 3 SEALs from SEAL Team 3's Charlie Platoon. Dr. Sterling stood in the back of the crowd. Brooke saw him only because she'd been waiting for him. Saw the color drain from his face like someone pulling a plug. Her medical knowledge was earned in theaters of combat that would break most people, Admiral Chen continued. And in this hospital, she was treated with less respect than the janitorial staff. A decision was made, by someone in this hospital, to interfere with her care of a Navy SEAL and to subsequently falsify her personnel records to justify her termination. This administration recognizes that we made grave errors in judgment. Senior Chief Sullivan is hereby offered reinstatement with full back pay, a formal apology, and a position of her choosing. Additionally, she will receive a presidential invitation to be honored for her service. And that invitation, the Admiral said, is something that cannot be rescinded, cannot be questioned, and cannot be earned any other way. The hospital board president was already reaching for his phone. Damage control. Lawyers. But it didn't matter anymore. The story was already out. By the time the local news crews arrived, everyone knew. On the 5th day, 2 FBI agents walked into Dr. Sterling's office. He was reviewing a patient chart, and he didn't look up immediately, a power play, a dominance move, but when he did, something in his expression shifted. The agents moved with the precision of people trained to take down threats. Dr. David Sterling, the lead agent, said, "You're under investigation for falsifying medical records, forging professional credentials, and obstruction of federal investigation. We'd like to ask you some questions." Sterling stood. Composed. Professional. His voice was controlled. "I don't know what you're talking about. I terminated a nurse who violated scope of practice. That's within my authority as Chief of Surgery." "Sir," the second agent said, "we have your computer records. 47 altered entries in Brooke Sullivan's personnel file, going back 2 years. Timestamps on patient charts moved by up to 3 hours, conveniently placing you elsewhere during emergencies. And most significantly, we have evidence you attempted to forge her nursing degree documentation to create grounds for immediate termination without review." Sterling's jaw tightened. "My legal team will." "Your legal team is already coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's Office," the first agent said. "You have the right to remain silent." The handcuffs made a sound like ice cracking as they snapped around Sterling's wrists. Metal against bone. The sound that meant something was breaking and couldn't be put back together. He walked through the hospital lobby like a man moving through water, the agents flanking him with the ease of people who'd done this 100 times. The nurse's station, where he'd made his public bet that Brooke would quit within a week, fell silent as he passed. A dozen sets of eyes followed him. No one looked away. The cafeteria entrance was next. Several nurses stood there with coffee cups, and they watched in complete stillness as Sterling was escorted past. He caught their stares like punches. The walk that had always moved with confidence now moved with the rigid control of someone being physically restrained by invisible chains. At the front doors, Sterling made the mistake of turning to look back. Brooke stood in the corridor with her son, still in his dress whites. She took one measured breath, And in that breath was Sangin and 3 lost years and 43 lives saved and the knowledge that some things cannot be hidden. When she spoke, her voice had changed. It was lower. It carried the timbre of command. True class is what you do when the lights go out, Doctor. Sterling's face went white. Not from shame, from the sudden understanding that she'd never been prey. That every moment he'd tried to break her, he'd been performing for an audience that knew exactly who she was. The agents led him out into the Norfolk afternoon, and the glass doors closed behind him with a sound like a seal being broken. The investigation that followed was merciless. The hospital board convened. Sterling's research partnerships dissolved within 72 hours. His medical license suspension became permanent. A plea deal was negotiated that included the forfeiture of his credentials and the entire salary he'd earned while manipulating records, restitution flowing back to the hospital, to Brooke, to the patients whose care had been compromised. Within 2 weeks, someone spotted him in a strip mall parking lot on Ocean View Avenue, sitting at a folding table with a banner, Sterling Insurance Services. He wore a cheap suit. He handed out business cards to people who mostly ignored him. The photo circulated through Oak Creek Memorial's staff within hours. No one spoke about it much. Justice had a weight of its own. Brooke Sullivan stood in the Rose Garden 6 months later in her dress uniform, senior chief petty officer rank gleaming like the truth it was. Her son stood beside her in his submarine command whites. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Reeves stood on her other side, fully recovered, the man whose life she'd saved still bearing the mark of her hands in the steadiness of his breathing. Behind them stood Admiral Chen, and behind him, 30 former members of her Sangin unit who'd flown in for this single moment. The president spoke of valor. Of choices made in darkness. Of the quiet warriors who save lives not for recognition but because the choice to turn away is simply not possible for them. When it was over, when the cameras had finished, when the ceremony had collapsed into the ordinary business of standing and shaking hands, Brooke returned to her apartment. The shadow box was already hanging on her wall. Those worn combat boots, polished now, catching the light. Her medals arranged in ascending order. A photograph of her unit in Sangin, young faces looking directly at the camera with the kind of presence that only comes from having survived something. She didn't hide anymore. She stood in front of that shadow box and let the light catch every scar. The next day, she reported to her new position, Director of Emergency Medical Training at Oak Creek Memorial. Her office overlooked the parking lot where Sterling had once humiliated her. Below her name on the door, a small plaque, "True class is what you do when the lights go out." Every night shift nurse who passed it knew exactly what it meant. If you've made it this far, you know that the quietest person in the room might be the one holding everything together. Subscribe for more stories of hidden strength revealed. Like this video if you'd rather be underestimated. And comment, what would you have done?